Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you can just let me know where you're signing in from, I would love to just know a little bit about where you're coming from. And you can use the chat bar to say hi and to let me know where you're Zooming from. Nice. Michigan, Taos. I love Taos. Santa Clara, Las Vegas. Hi. Long Island. I swear I'm born and raised. And I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. So Bermuda. Wow, Memphis, Tennessee. Hi, neighbor. Albuquerque. I love it. Albany, New York. I went to Skidmore College up in Saratoga, so right by you. Florida. Hi. Canada. I love the Canadians. They always come in here. It's so great. Pennsylvania. Very cool. California. I hope you guys are staying safe. It's a crazy time right now. Chicago, Boston. Yeah, I bet it's hard to breathe there. My God. Nebraska. Hello from Connecticut. Hi, Oregon, Syracuse, Seattle. We have got everyone, all the states represented. This is wonderful. Okay, Colorado. Fantastic. Portland, Oregon. Rhode Island, Massachusetts. I went to school in Massachusetts too, around Framingham. Very cool. I'm so happy you guys, Washington, very nice. So happy you guys could all make it, especially you East Coasters. This is late. This is late for me, for sure. I mean, not as late for me because it's 7 here. San Francisco, I hope you guys are staying safe too. Okay, so from the last presentation, I don't know if any of you guys attended that, and just shout out if you did. But one of the things that I got some feedback on was that you wanted some things to look at besides my face, like some slides and things, so I did that, and we have some slides. We aren't going to keep them up for that long because they're really just bullet points, but there'll be some visuals for you guys to just kind of refer to and kind of like keep us organized a little bit. So I think, let's see, people are slowing down, coming in. New York City, that's where I moved from. I moved from Manhattan to Nashville. Okay, so people are slowly slowing down. So I think that hi, Alabama. I think that we should begin. So last time, we spoke about the main culprits of relational trauma and why children are vulnerable to relational trauma. And I thought that this time we could talk about our boundary system and how that gets all kinds of distorted from relational trauma. And I thought that I would make this an entire presentation because it is so complex, our boundary system, and there's all different kinds of boundaries we have. So I wanted to really focus on boundary systems this time during this talk. So without any further ado, this is going to be how our boundary systems are affected by relational trauma. So if we can get the next slide up, and we will begin. And all of this is going to be recorded, and I will send it out to you guys tomorrow or by the end of this week, just so in case you missed any of it or anything like that, that you can come back and see. So we're just going to do The first section is going to be about what a boundary system is, how I define a boundary system as a clinician. And then we're going to look at functional boundaries, what those look like. And then we're going to look at the dysfunctional boundary systems. And then lastly, healing the dysfunctional boundary systems. So if we can do next slide, what is a boundary system? So again, I'm sorry, I totally skipped an introduction. My name is Heather Monroe. I'm an integrative psychotherapist with a license in clinical social work. And I specialize in trauma and the effects that it has in our ability to connect with ourselves and with the world around us. And so with, in regards to a boundary system and how relational trauma affects our boundary system, let's first look at just the basics of what is a boundary system in general. So a boundary system is what protects us and contains us. So it's really important to note that it's about protection and containment. And when we protect ourselves, we keep ourselves from being victims. So it is an act of self-care and inherent worth when we protect ourselves and when we know how to protect ourselves. When we contain ourselves, and we're going to talk about what containment means, when we contain ourselves, that is so that we don't offend others. And so that we don't come across as offensive. And it is an act of respect and also inherent worth, because there is a sense of my worth is no greater than and no less than anybody else's inherent worth in this world. And so I'm going to contain my thoughts and feelings and behaviors in an appropriate way so that I don't offend anybody else in my sphere. So a boundary system is also, there's internal boundary system and then there's an external boundary system. The internal boundary systems that I'm going to talk about are the ones that are around like thoughts, feelings, and spirituality. Spirituality. And the external boundary system is going to be, as you would have guessed, it's going to be the physical boundary system and how have to do with our boundaries. I mean, our boundaries around our bodies, around our property, and that kind of stuff. So boundary system is about protection and containment. If you guys have any questions throughout this, just put it into the Q&A box, and I will hopefully, I think I'll have time to kind of get through all of those or get through a bunch of them. So the other important thing to know about boundaries is that our boundary system tells us who we are. And this is what I find to be like so fascinating about a boundary system, is that when my boundary system is ignited, that's giving me so much information about who I am and what I feel comfortable with. So a boundary system tells us who we are. It tells us how we treat ourselves, how we treat ourselves and how we treat other people. It also tells us what's okay, what feels safe, and what doesn't feel safe. So there's just like all this information embedded in our boundaries, and we're really able on the healing level, right? So when we need to heal ourselves, I find that a shortcut to healing is through our boundary system, because when we practice protecting ourselves, we practice confidence and self-worth, and that builds on itself. So there's a sense of healing through our boundary system and how effective that is in healing self-esteem, becoming resilient, all those other things. So let's go to the next slide. Let's see. Hold on, waiting for that. Okay. So functional boundaries, protected and connected. So this is the way that I look at boundaries and a functional boundary. When we have a functional boundary system, we can protect ourselves while staying in connection with other people. So there is a sense of, I know how to protect myself, and if I cannot protect myself, I can ask for help, and that's okay. There's no shame around that, around asking for help. But I have confidence in my ability to protect myself. The other thing is that I don't have relational walls up, meaning that I can let other people into my mind, into my thoughts, into my feelings. I can have intimacy, right? So I can be connected while staying protected. And that's I'm going to give you a lot of examples of what that looks like. Of what that looks like when we go into the dysfunctional the dysfunctional boundary system. So next slide. Okay, let's go into the problem before we go into the solution. So this is the dysfunctional boundary system. I like to divide it into two places. There is the boundary-less person, and there's the boundary-full person. The boundary-less person is going to be connected but not protected. We, as a boundaryless people, have a really hard time protecting ourselves. We have a hard time stating what our boundaries are. And that has a lot to do with where we come from and our family of origin, and what we were taught about our boundaries as children. So another way that we can look at this, if you're more familiar with let's say you're a clinician here, another way that we can look at this is through attachment styles. So anxiously attached people tend to be a little bit more boundaryless, and avoidantly attached people tend to be more boundaryful. So there's a boundaryless, and then there's boundaryful. There's also contained, overly contained people, and uncontained people. So let's look at the origins of all this. If you can, and there's so many different examples, and so when we get into each boundary style, or each boundary that we're going to look at, I'm going to go into specific examples of this. But if you came from a family where your parents sometimes got it right, but most of the time got it wrong around your emotional needs. So your emotional needs were not fulfilled by your parents. They couldn't meet you where you were at emotionally. You are going to have a sense of anxiety around people showing up for you. And there is going to be a deep fear of abandonment. So when we are anxiously attached, it is when there is a consistent disruption in the areas of love and safety, in the areas of being heard and validated, of our emotional needs being met in the family system. And when there is consistent disruption and your parents get it wrong most of the time, you're going to feel really anxious about whether they're going to get it right this time in the moment that you're having an emotional need. So you are going to tend to cling to the person that's causing you harm, or cling to the person who isn't meeting you emotionally where you need to be. So when that happens, we're going to have a really hard time stating what our boundaries are, because we're going to be so scared that that person is going to leave us if we state what our boundaries are. We're also so good at, we are so sensitive to social cues that where people turn away from us, that we will tend to bend ourselves into pretzels in order to make people stay. And in order to bend ourselves, we have to have boundary violations. It is, we allow ourselves to be victims a lot of the time because we aren't being who we truly are out of fear of being left. Does that make sense? A boundaryful person can come from a family where the parents never really met the emotional needs of them. So they had to learn at a really young age that mom and dad are never going to get it right, which means that I'm not going to be able to depend on them or anybody. Not only am I not going to be able to depend on them, I'm never going to let someone get close to me. Because if I let someone get close to me, they're going to leave me. So I am going to try my hardest throughout my life to block intimacy and to create relational walls. So a boundary-full person is going to have these really, really skilled and really sophisticated. They're going to have really sophisticated ways of building barriers around themselves so that no one can infiltrate them. Another way that someone can be boundary-full, or someone can be, let me get this right, sorry. As far as containment, okay, containment goes, just because you're boundaryless doesn't mean you're necessarily uncontained. Let's say you are a boundaryless person, you don't know how to protect yourself, okay? But you're so scared of people leaving you that you are actually overly contained. You try not to let anybody know what you're feeling because you're so scared that will be too much for them to handle. So you tend to be overly contained in your expressions, which we're going to go into specifics. But with an uncontained person, let's say you grew up in a family where mom or dad were rageaholics, where there was emotional incest, like what I spoke about in the last webinar, where there was like an uncontained sexual energy going on in the family system. If there was abuse of any kind, physical, that's being uncontained, sexual, verbal, all these things are being uncontained. So you might learn how to be uncontained yourself because of that. The other way that you can do this is if you were falsely empowered as a child. If there was a sense that your worth was better than somebody else's worth. So that can cause uncontainment too. So let's go to the next slide and really look at each system, each boundary, and go through all of them. Okay, so let's start with intellectual boundaries. Okay, so if you grew up in a family where your ideas, beliefs, and perceptions were disregarded on a consistent basis or invalidated, if there was a sense that your ideas and thoughts either A, didn't matter, or B, they were wrong because they didn't fit into what the family's ideas, beliefs, and thoughts were, there is going to be a sense of boundarylessness to you. What I mean by that is a child in this instant will grow up thinking that other people's thoughts, beliefs, and ideas are somehow more important than their own because they've been conditioned to question the validity of their ideas and perceptions and beliefs. Does that make sense to everyone? Just give a yes if it does. I just want to make sure that I'm on track here with people understanding. Okay, great. So when we grow up thinking that our ideas and our beliefs and perceptions mean less than other people's, we tend to have what I like to call a watery sense of perception, meaning that if we if we say something that we believe, if we state a thought or an idea, and someone comes back at us with a more confidence in their idea or their thought, it's like ducking. It's like coming from a less than perspective or a boundaryless perspective. If someone barks louder than you, then they must be right, because that's kind of what happened in the family. Does that make sense? So if someone has a more confident portrayal of their idea, we take on that idea. Like, it infiltrates the boundary that we have around our own ideas, and we say, oh, we must be wrong. Like, we must be wrong, they must be right. So you can imagine how disorienting being unboundaried is, being boundaryless is. It's incredibly disorienting, because you're constantly shifting around the ideas of others. And there's no sense of a fixed belief system. It's more like we look to the outside world to tell us what to believe in, because we have a really hard time having confidence in our intuition, or listening to our intuition and following what our perceptions are, what our thoughts are, and what our ideas are. So what a healthy boundary system would look like would be, if somebody says something that counteracts our idea, that we can think about it. Like, I heard you, I heard that person's idea, try it on. Like, does that feel right to me? Does that feel right in my body? And if it doesn't, let it go, right? We can just let it go. And we're going to go more into that when we get to the healing part. Then when we get to intellectual boundaries from a boundary-full place, okay? Oh, one last thing with boundaryless. So in intellectual boundaries, we are connected to the people who are telling us their ideas, right? But we are not protected. Like, we don't have any protection around our own belief system so that they don't infiltrate us. But we're still connected to them. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, when we go to the boundary full person, they're going to be protected but not connected. So this is what happens when you are falsely empowered as a child, when you are led to believe that your ideas, your beliefs, and your perceptions matter more than other people's. It also goes into self-esteem, that somehow your inherent worth is greater than other people's inherent worth. There's a false empowerment that goes on between the parent and the child, where the child is made to feel better than. So in false empowerment, false entitlement. The other way that this can happen with being boundaryful is when you come from a family where your emotional needs were never met, you start to have a survival system. So it's actually a brilliant way of surviving as a child, the avoidant attachment style. You make it so that I'm the only one who can take care of myself. Hence, my ideas can be the only ones that matter, because an exchange of ideas, because of an exchange of back and forth and me letting someone else's ideas in, means connection, and it means a sense of intimacy. And that is incredibly dangerous to me, because if I let someone in, they could abandon me, which is what happened in the initial heartbreak of the child when their parents continuously emotionally abandoned them. So it can come from false empowerment. It can come from being abandoned emotionally and intellectually time and time again from your parents, so that you take on that your ideas are the only ones that matter, because they're the ones that made you survive. And there is, there's that sense of, there's a disconnection. There's just a disconnection with intimacy there. So you have to devalue, in order to be boundaryful on this level, you have to devalue other people. Uh, and in order to be boundaryless, you have to devalue yourself. Does that make sense? It's like, in order to not let anyone else's ideas into our system of being as humans, we have to create a steel wall of you don't matter, right? These thoughts don't matter. I am right, you are wrong. There's just a polarization. On the other hand, it's my thoughts don't matter. You are totally right. I am so wrong. I don't know who I am, that kind of thing. Now, when it comes to containment with intellectual boundaries, we're going to look at an overly contained person is going to be scared to speak their mind, be scared to speak what their beliefs and ideas are and what their perception is. They're going to be scared to do that. An uncontained person is going to not be able to read the room, is going to, again, be a little bit devaluing, and is going to believe that there's a right and wrong. So when you come across someone who's uncontained intellectually, there is an energy to them that is big. It's big. And when you come across a very contained person intellectually, there's almost like a rigidness and a smallness to them, right? Does that make sense? So when someone's uncontained intellectually, their energy is big, it can be aggressive, it's dismissive, and it's not inclusive. It is very much, it feels uncontained. Like, that's the only word I can use for it. It just feels uncontained. It's like an assault. Like, they just come at you and you're like, oh my gosh, wow, that person's really uncontained around their ideas. So that's kind of what it feels like. Let's go to emotional boundaries. I love this one. Okay, so emotional boundaries. If emotions in your family were denied, invalidated on a consistent basis, so your emotions are denied and invalidated on a consistent basis, there is going to be, you might grow up to feel like, one, your emotions don't matter, but let me go deeper on the origins part of it. If you grew up in a family where your feelings didn't matter, they were invalidated, and also your caretaker's feelings mattered more than yours, right? So there was a sense of their feelings mattered more, and they also, gosh, you also tended to be very sensitive to other people's feelings around you. You are going to grow up feeling like when someone has an emotion, okay, so a boundaryless person around emotions. When someone has an emotion, we are going to take it on as our own. And I mean this in a couple of ways. One is we might feel responsible for that person's emotion. So if someone comes to you and they're angry, there is a freeze or the nervous system is activated. Either way, the nervous system is activated. And we almost feel like, without them saying anything, that it's our fault. Not only is it our fault, we are responsible for fixing the emotion. So we are unable to have someone have an emotion without us trying to fix it, without us taking it on, and without us having a reaction to their reactivity. Does that make sense? So a healthy emotional boundary system would look like, that person is angry, right? I can ask them questions and connect with them and see what's going on, but I'm protected. Like, if they're angry with me, I can see what my part is. One, I can check if I have a part, right? I can see what it is, and I can take responsibility for my part in it. And I can feel bad and remorseful and things like that. But when I talk about a boundaryless person, we have a tendency to take on other people's emotions. We also have a tendency to carry other people's emotions for them. So if you grew up in a household where there was rage or there was depression or there was a lot of unhealed big emotions from your caretakers, you might have become a vessel for their feelings. So in what I mean by that is, you take on those feelings as your own, but they aren't your own. This is what happens with generational trauma, is that a legacy is carried down from generation to generation to generation. So you might be carrying grief that has been carried down for generations that isn't even your own grief. You don't even know the origins of the grief. But because you haven't learned emotional boundaries, you just don't question it. You feel something big come at you and it just overtakes you. Now, a boundaryful person is going to, again, you are with a boundaryless mentality, you are very connected. You're very connected to people. You're highly sensitive, but it's a confusion with intensity versus intimacy, right? So intensity is what I just explained. It's taking on people's feelings as your own. It's taking on carried emotions. It's not, it's taking responsibility for other people's anger or other people's sadness. And it's also taking on the need to fix them. That is intensity. That is not intimacy. Intimacy would be a much more balanced sense of interdependency. So just a side note here, codependency has gotten, that word has gotten it's gotten very muddied and very confused. All adult attachment science tells us is that interdependency is crucial to our well-being as humans. It is not a bad thing to be dependent on each other. It is not a bad thing to feel like I am responsible for the well-being of my partner to a certain extent. But so I just want to say that because intimacy isn't about not being dependent and not being affected by emotions, because that's compassion and that's empathy and that's sympathy, right? But it's about, intimacy is also about knowing who we are within the emotions of others, knowing what's ours and knowing what's theirs, knowing what's carried, what's being thrown at us, and being able to not take it on, to have the choice, right? Intensity is just letting everything blow our way and having our nervous system all messed up and conditioned to be in fight or flight or freeze all the time. I see a hand raised, but if you want to put it in the Q&A, if you have a question, go for it, and I'll try and get to it. I'll try and get to it by the end. So, being boundaryful, you can imagine it's going to be the opposite. So if I am boundaryful, I am going to be able to have relational walls, right? It's like, oh man, as someone who has healed from being boundaryless and who kind of like errs on the side of boundarylessness, I would be lying if I didn't say that, that there is a little bit of envy around the boundaryful person. That boundaryful people are so highly skilled at just having these relational walls. They are so protected. So a boundaryful person, but here's the downside. There's always an upside and a downside, right? The upside of being boundaryless is that we have connection in our lives, which we know is an integral part of happiness as a human being. The downside, the upside of boundaryful is that we have these walls and we're protected from other people's emotions. The downside is we have a really hard time connecting with people. So a boundaryful person, emotional boundaryful person, is going to have a hard time feeling empathy. They're going to have a hard time relating to other people's emotions. There is an emotional numbness to a boundaryful person when in regards to emotions. It's like they're barely living relationally because there's no connection. So So there's a deep loneliness there. There's a deep loneliness for the boundaryful person. There's a lot of protection. Yeah, someone's feelings can't infiltrate them. Someone's feelings can't go past the barrier. So they are, in a sense, like really protected from being affected by other people, which is amazing and perfect because that's their defense mechanism. That is what allowed them to survive all those years within that family system. But we crave connection as human beings. It is physiologically and biologically in our makeup. So a boundaryful person is missing out on the connection of emotions. And in order to have intimacy, you must have emotions, right? So they will be walled off emotionally. Nothing goes in. And so they have a hard time expressing their emotions. They have a hard time feeling emotions. I hear from a lot of people that have that are boundaryful emotionally that they feel numb a lot. Like there's this numbness, and they only feel things when they're really intense. So just like a boundaryless person confuses intensity with intimacy for their reasons, a boundaryful person confuses intensity with intimacy as well. Because intimacy feels scary, intensity feels alive. Does that make sense? Like you emotionally feel alive in a toxic relationship. So that is what an emotional boundaryful person looks like. Okay, let's talk about containment really fast with emotions. So where am I on time? Okay, gosh, you guys, there's not enough time. As far as containment, so if you're overly contained emotionally, you're not going to know what you feel a lot of the time. You are going to be really disconnected from your body, because through your body is how you understand emotions, right? It's the physiological that leads to the feeling that you can label. If you are uncontained, that means that you are unable to regulate your emotions. And there's a lot of different ways that you can try and regulate your emotions. One of my favorite uncontained behaviors that is really obvious is somebody who tries to regulate their emotions verbally. So someone who's constantly talking, like da, 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 da. And what they're doing is they're trying to regulate their nervous system with their words. So I know you guys all know someone like that, if not yourself, where there's just a constant incessant chatter, and they could be saying these things in one sentence, but it's like a constant trying to regulate their emotions, their nervous system. So that is one way that we can be emotionally uncontained. And another way that we can be emotionally uncontained is rage, right? Which is uncontained anger. Not being able, when we don't express what we're feeling because we think that someone's going to leave us, then it goes and goes and goes and goes, and then it blows up, right? So it's that blow up, that uncontainment. That's what uncontained emotions look like. Okay, let's get through physical boundaries. Physical boundaries. So let's look at coronavirus, because oh my God, this has been, from a clinical perspective, this has been so interesting as far as the spotlight on boundaries with coronavirus. So let's say you go to a party and somebody comes to hug you, and your boundary system is activated. You know that you aren't comfortable with them hugging you, but you let them hug you anyways. That is being boundaryless. That is not protecting yourself. That is caring more about how that other person is going to think about you. If you say, hey, I'm just not comfortable hugging at this point, you're more concerned about how they are going to think about you than protecting yourself and protecting your body. Physical boundaries are all about, I decide, I have the inherent right, as everyone else does, to decide who touches me, when, where, and how, right? That is my inherent right as a human being. So you can only imagine what happens to a child or a person, not just children, but a person who experiences sexual abuse, right? There is no sense of boundaries. There is no sense of our own body almost. it is a really, it creates such a dysfunctional sense of who we are, what our reality is, that we're unable to protect ourselves. And that's in the examples of sexual abuse, which I could do a whole lecture on, but we won't go into it here. So being boundaryless is, let's say a guy at work or a girl at work makes you feel uncomfortable. You don't, you find them kind of, I don't know, they just are, you're uncomfortable around them and they always want to give you a hug and you let them give you a hug every single time. That again is a boundary violation, and it's you not taking care of yourself. It's you not being able to say, hey, I'm good. I'm actually not, I'd rather just do a wave or whatever. Then we look at containment and uncontainment around physical boundaries. So let's again take coronavirus, for instance. So let's say that you are somebody who feels comfortable not wearing a mask, going on airplanes, traveling a lot, going, hanging out with groups of 12 or more, dining inside, like more of a high risk exposure than somebody who isn't like that, right? That is totally fine. Like there should be no judgment around that. That is your own personal choice. Where it gets into a containment issue is if you go into somebody else's sphere, right? Like let's say you just get off a plane, you were around a lot of people, you were dining in a lot at restaurants, you weren't wearing a mask at all, like all these things, which is, again, it's totally fine. But let's say that the day after all that happens, you go to somebody's house and you start commenting about all these things you did and you don't think it's that big of a deal, and everybody, is making such a big deal out of this and it really isn't. What two boundaries are uncontained right there? Intellectual boundaries, right? Thinking that your way and what you think is the right way, everyone's making a big deal. This isn't such a, everyone's got to chill out. So that would be an intellectual uncontainment. If you aren't open to other people saying, I don't know, I'm kind of like nervous about it, and you get defensive about it, that's being uncontained intellectually. And if you're hugging people and standing close and not respecting their boundaries, their physical boundaries. So a contained way to go about this experience that we're all in right now is letting someone know before you go over to their house, hey, this is what I'm practicing, like around the coronavirus. What are you practicing? So that everyone has their cards out on the table and we're all being respectful to each other. And again, it's not about judging what you're doing. It's just more about being respectful of that other people might be doing other things than you are. Does that make sense? I hope so. So that's physical boundaries, containment and uncontainment. And then lastly, spiritual boundaries. So I'm going to get a little kind of ethereal here around like spirituality and all that stuff. But I consider what I look at as spirituality is connection to ourselves, to each other, and to the world around us. I believe that connection is a spiritual phenomenon that happens to us, that it elevates us and that it creates love, right? Which I believe to be a spiritual principle. So if we're looking at spirituality as connection to ourselves and that divine connection, and when I talk about a divine connection, I mean a connection that comes from within. It can't be taken away necessarily. It's almost like our intuition. It's a sense that we are precious, that we are precious divine beings of creation, So if we look at spiritual boundaries like this, if you experienced abuse as a child, you experienced a spiritual violation, that there was a aggressive attack on your connection and your preciousness. So when somebody's spiritual boundaries are violated, there's a couple different ways that this can happen. This can absolutely happen when cults are involved. right? When there is a sense of taking advantage of people due to their spiritual preferences. There can also be spiritual boundaries violated in religions. If a child is meant to feel shame around who they are or what they believe in, that's going to really affect the way that they later on connect to whatever they want to connect with or whatever they want to believe in. So that there is spiritual violations that have to do with connection. That is the 4 different types of boundaries and all the different ways that we can be boundaryless or boundaryful. So let's talk about healing the boundaryless. Okay. I believe that all healing is rooted in awareness. I believe that the foundation for optimal health and well-being is first and foremost being aware. So start right here with this talk, right? Just being aware of whether you are boundaryless or not and how you're boundaryless, what boundaries you tend to be boundaryless around. That is just going to bring the awareness. We used to be on autopilot until we learned this information. And then after learning this information, what will happen is you will start to connect the dots. When these triggers and these boundaries are being violated, you'll understand, oh yeah, I'm being triggered. I feel like there's a boundary violation going on here. So another thing is identifying your triggers. Absolutely understanding what feels usually after the fact in the beginning, right? So what felt like a boundary violation to you? This could even be like someone who's consistently late and someone who's consistently late and you get really upset about it, right? It really bugs you. That's because that is a boundary you have. You have a boundary about punctuality. So again, learning what your triggers are and learning about what that tells you about yourself. So taking the emotions and the shame or any emotions that come with it and just looking at it as information. So triggers are when our boundary systems are activated. With being boundaryless, one of the big things that is going to be a huge healing modality is getting in touch with our bodies. So understanding what the physiological symptoms are when our boundaries are violated. Usually that has to do with heart rate, right? Sweaty hands, sweaty armpits, knowing when we feel uncomfortable, right? And the only way that we can know when we feel uncomfortable is to tap into our bodies. They have all the information in the world. I also include feelings into the body system. So when you have a feeling, there's a physiological sensation to that feeling. So getting really familiar with each feeling and how that carries throughout your body. What does shame feel like? What does guilt feel like? What does resentment feel like? What does happiness and joy feel like? What does sadness and what does anxiety feel like in your body? And this is why it's really good to have a therapist or do this on your own as a practice to just get really, really comfortable with bodily sensations, which is usually a whole process of healing onto itself because we disconnect so much with our bodies in order to just survive chaotic situations. So identifying that somatic experience. The other thing is that if you tend to be like a blow up emotional person, like be a little uncontained emotionally, then it's going to be about getting in touch with the subtleties of the body. Like what happens is you ignore the symptoms, the beginning symptoms. You don't cut it off at the track because you don't know how the beginning symptoms feel, or it feels like it goes really fast. So part of the therapy and healing process is slowing down the emotions, seeing how it goes bit by bit. And then the other thing, which is the hardest one, is behavior. It's going to be about learning step by step, little by little. It's almost like exposure therapy. It's learning little by little how to protect ourselves as boundaryless people. We don't really need to work on connection. We have that. We have that sense of connection with people. It's going to be about the little ways that we can learn how to protect ourselves. So again, start little. I wouldn't start big. I would start very small with safe people. So we learn what our trigger, we are aware, we learn what our triggers are, we learn what things feel like in our bodies, and then we put those things into practice by protecting ourselves and not letting ourselves be a victim of other people violating our boundaries. And this is going to take practice and review. It's practice and review again and again and again. Okay, so lastly is going to be healing the boundaryful. So same with the boundaryless, it's going to be the awareness, right? So that you've gotten from this webinar, I hope, that there's a sense of what I'm boundaryful about, where I'm protected and not connected. Identifying when our relational walls go up. So do our relational walls go up with emotions? What does it look like when relational walls go up? Do I tend to cut the person off, meaning I start to not listen to them and I start to think about other things, like I kind of just go away mentally so I don't have to deal with their emotions? So what are my triggers? Identifying deactivating behavior. So this is what I mean by that. Boundaryful people, in order to keep intimacy at bay and connection at bay, we have what is called deactivating behavior. This is what it's called in attachment science. So there's lots of ways that we deactivate and we deactivate connection. We tend to, again, not listen to people when we feel triggered. We can devalue others in order to make ourselves feel better than. So when we catch ourselves devaluing, the trick is to be able to come from not a place of lack. It's coming from a place of lack when we devalue. There's a sense of there's not enough to go around. So when we find ourselves devaluing others, there's this whole concept of being able to actually say to yourself in your head, to your thoughts, cancel, 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 cancel. So whenever you find yourself devaluing others, you say in your head, cancel. And it stops and interrupts the thought, and we're able to reset. So I would try that. I would also try when you are devaluing others, just to stop, just to be able to, again, be able to say, my inherent worth is no better and no less than this person's inherent worth. There's also a sense of letting someone be who they are, right? Just as you are allowed to be who you are. Another big thing with boundaryful people, it's also about practice, and it's about practicing not just thoughts, because it's not just about behaviors. It's about practicing getting in touch with our bodies, so the somatic experience, which is going to be much harder for boundaryful people. So it's about practicing getting inside of our bodies. It's about practicing being vulnerable. It's about practicing letting people come in and letting other people's thoughts and emotions come into our sphere. So again, all this takes time and it takes practice. But with awareness, identifying triggers, knowing what our deactivating behaviors are, and I can go into a lot more depth about that at another time, but learning about what our deactivating behaviors are, how we push away connection, and then instead of pushing away, leaning into it, right? So identifying what those are and leaning into connection rather than pushing it away, and then practicing connection and reviewing, right? What you did right and what you did wrong in that instance. So I hope, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to get to questions. I can't believe I only have 6 minutes left. Thank you so much. This was amazing. There are all different ways that you can connect with me. The last one on r2o.com is it needs to be a subscription base, but I give a talk every Tuesday night for Recovery 2.0 community on all these things, on different topics that create awareness and consciousness inside of us. So if you wanted to do that, you would have to subscribe. But besides from that, my website, monroewellness.com, and my Instagram, and I will also be sending out other information about other webinars. I'm going to be doing a webinar for you guys free once a month and just covering topics. So please let me know what interests you in regards to your own healing. Like, that's really important. I want to know what interests you in regards to what you want to learn about in order to heal from. So I know you'll be getting a survey, and please bring that into it, just what you would like for your own healing. So let's get to some questions. I've got a second left. Okay. As a parent whose parents didn't get it right most of the time, how can I break the cycle with my children? I love this question. I often feel I'm overcompensating emotionally with my kids, but can be clueless at times as well. I'm a single parent and my life is absorbed with my kids to the point I don't have long-term relationships with others. That is, wow. Okay. So first of all, kindness towards yourself. Just like take a breath and know that you are doing the best that you can. I also want to say that just as generational trauma seeps down into the family system, also generational healing does. So you have already, I bet I bet money that you have already repaired some of the woundings that have been passed down to you generationally. And you need to give yourself the space to acknowledge that. So that's number one. Number two is the way that you become, the way that you break the cycle is becoming aware of what the cycle is and what you want to break. That's like number one. And two is not looking at the relationship with your children, but looking at the relationship with yourself. When we heal as human beings, and we happen to be parents as well, we automatically change the relationship with the children. So when we change ourselves, we change our relationship with everything around us, including our children. So the shortcut to repairing the relationship with our children is repairing the relationship with ourselves. If we do not do that, we will never be able to repair what we want to with other people. 3 minutes. Okay, here we go. My mom teaches my twin sisters that she treats them like their stuff don't stink, if that makes sense. Yep, absolutely. It absolutely does. I'm curious how you see gender playing into containment. Oh, that's interesting. So I would have more questions about that. Gender is, we are learning so much about gender and how people identify gender as being really fluid. For some people, gender feels very fluid. So I actually don't define. It would be the way that you see your gender, which would be contained or uncontained, meaning I would look at it more as intellectual boundaries. So if you don't see gender as fluid, like that's fine, and that's fine. But when you start making your opinion around gender, or anything for that matter, I mean, look at our politics right now. If you start making that the only thing that's true, that's where you get into uncontainment, right? It's around the ideas of gender rather than gender itself. To clarify previously, I mean how gender socialization affects its containment. Oh my gosh, well, this is such a great question. It's everything. It's everything. So, oh gosh, boys don't cry. Girls aren't supposed to be sad. I mean, girls aren't supposed to get angry. You can only imagine what that does. And this is why I specialize in trauma, because it's not just relational trauma, it's societal trauma, it's cultural trauma, it's global trauma. It's all the ways that we think and we try to contain and stick into a box that creates injury with who we are as people. So absolutely, by putting societal norms on children, we are not allowing them to be themselves, right? What if you have a little boy who just cries? That's how he expresses himself. And telling him that boys don't cry is dismissing and validating his feelings, right? It's about invalidation. Can a person be a bit of both? I'm thinking boundaryless and boundaryful. Absolutely. It all depends on where you're triggered. So you're boundaryful may be triggered, and then your boundaryless may be triggered. It's all about that. What is argumentative? Oh gosh, guys, I'm so sorry. We're out of time. Again, I'll be doing another webinar for you next month. So please let me know what you want to hear about, what you want to talk about, what you want to heal from, and I will put together something for you guys. And I appreciate it so much. Again, reach out to me at Heather@Monroe Wellness. If you have any more questions. And also, again, you can find me on Instagram, Monroe Wellness, and visit my website at monroewellness.com. And I so look forward to seeing you all again next month. Okay, talk to you later. Bye. Have a great night.